My name is Kevin, and this isn't the first time I've done this. I've actually preached a Sunday morning before up in New England, and believe it or not, during my first sermon, I was praying, and in the middle of the sermon, the sound system just went, blew up. So no pressure on Sharon and Stuart back there. They did say that they would turn on my mic when we were singing, so they did threaten that on me if I didn't behave up here. So I'm so honored to be with you guys today. This is just such a privilege. We have a lot of new people here, and if I missed you this morning, or if Pastor Mark missed you this morning, we want to invite you to fill out a blue card. They're in the seat pouch in front of you. So there's blue cards available. Fill it out. Make sure you come up and introduce yourself afterwards. We'll be looking for you. We have a blue bag that we would like to give to you as a gift, as a way of saying thank you and welcome for being here. So I'm not sure what you came in this morning, what baggage you brought in, checked in at the door. It could be maybe you're out there struggling with an addiction. Maybe you're just dealing with a loss of a loved one. Or maybe you're just out there struggling with health issues. Or maybe you messed up, because I know I have. I know everyone in this room has messed up before. And maybe you messed up big and you're struggling with an unknown future. What's going to happen tomorrow? I just want to tell you that there's no better place to cast our fears and our worries, our concerns, our sins than the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ. And we're so happy that you're here with us, because we want to put Christ in the right place. We want to put him at the center of our lives, and we want to worship him today. Now, I don't know how many of you out there have said this before. I know I have, and I'll put this in Southern spec or Southern speech. But this ain't the country I grew up in. How many of you identify with that? We got a few hands, Jay, Pastor, yep. So probably about 3/4 of you, right? And it's not hard to see that we're kind of changing as a country. We're evolving, maybe not so much for the better. And I just want to read some statistics to you. But, while I was up in Vermont, during my first 2 internships, I encountered students that never heard of Jesus Christ before. Can you believe that? And these people celebrated Christmas and Easter, and they never knew who it was about. Right? Isn't that scary? Just a statistic here. This is from Willis & Co. and Life on Mission. This statistic comes from 2014, so it's probably might be worse now. Of America's 316 million people, evangelicals account for about 22 to 28 million. That means a staggering 93% are non-evangelicals. That's scary. And, my whole role here is not to scare you or to, cause fear. But I just wanted to be fair and honest about the current reality in which we face. How many of you received the bulletin today? All right. You may have read the title already, but the title of today's sermon is In the Fiery Furnace of the World. And you can see I wore red today to fit the theme. All right. I know it's not Christmas yet, but, it's terrifying. And I know Pastor Randy Krantz in the past has previously talked about how America's constantly shifting in a direction that we're not proud of. And my goal isn't to discourage you. And, I hope after today's lesson that you feel encouraged, that you would feel excited about what Christ is doing, because sometimes when it seems like the world is stacked against us, that's when our faith is tested. It's put through the furnace. Right, where you have to stand on something, and we're going to stand on the Word of God today. So I'm going to invite you to open up your Bibles today to Daniel chapter 3. So Daniel chapter 3, if you open up your Bible to the middle, it's a little bit after the middle of the Bible, so you just split it down the middle like Moses in the Red Sea, and it should be a little bit after that. So Daniel chapter 3, and if you don't have a Bible, if you didn't bring one, there should be some in the seat pouches in front of you. If you don't have one, don't fear. Put up your hand, and a deacon would be more than happy to get you a Bible. So this is a story that you don't want to miss. So let me ask you a question. Who is the book of Daniel about? Probably Daniel himself, right? And I want to invite you to turn there if you haven't turned there already. But you might be sitting out in the crowd, And you might not know who Daniel is. I know a lot of us grew up in Sunday school. We know who Daniel is, but a lot of people might not. So Daniel is the central character of the book of Daniel. Daniel is an extremely intelligent Israelite man that was serving in Babylon during the time. And you might be wondering, well, how did a Jew who's on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea get to Babylon, which is in the middle of the desert, in the Mesopotamian valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates? So two different parts of the geological sphere, right? So how do they get from one place to another? So I'm going to get there. The Jews were going through what is called a time of the great exile. They had forgotten their first love, the Lord their God. They turned to things that didn't honor God, pagan worship, debaucherous activities, whatever it may be. They turned to those things and they started focusing on them. They started worshiping them as their idols. Because of their sin, God had decided that he was going to judge them. And there's various ways that God has used judgment to judge his people. Now, this isn't a mean, nasty judgment, but it's more of like correcting a child, right? If a child screws up, you correct them. Why? Because you love them. You want to bring them back on to the same page, right? So one of the ways that God judges is he removes his seal of protection upon his people. And he allows a conquering nation to come in and to drive out the wickedness, to drive out the problems. But oftentimes these countries that came in brought their own wickedness with them. In this case, it was the Babylonians. Now, the Jews at the time, in Scripture, it's kind of referred to them as being an unfaithful spouse, right? Their first love should be the Lord as their husband, right? Think of the nation of Israel as a wife, and they start taking on other husbands and other suitors and other lovers. Whether it's sin, whether it's the world, it's like a salad bar. They're just taking what they want, right? They're unfaithful to God. So God, is not the initiator of removing his protection from them. It's actually the people, right? Because they're turning their back on God. They're saying, you know what? I'm going to search for something else that satisfies me more. You might be thinking, well, how ungrateful, right? So we know that, from the text that Daniel, if we look back at Daniel 1, Daniel 2, Daniel's a man of royal stock. And the Babylonians saw him as someone that can contribute to their society. That's what the Babylonians do. They take people that are the cream of the crop, the best of the best. Your engineers, your military, mighty men. And what they want to do is they want to integrate them into their society. Why? Because they want to grow. They want to become stronger. And Daniel was a very gifted man. He was given the ability to interpret dreams. And he started rising up in the ranks in the Babylonian court because he was able to interpret dreams. And he got to work with a man. He was the Babylonian king. His name was King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar II, more formally, was a warrior king. He advanced the borders of his land. He was strong. He was proud. He was mighty. He was bold. As the Jews were being introduced into the society, they started to lose their identity as the people of God. They started adapting, kind of taking off their coat, shaking off everything that they knew to be as Israelites. They were called to be set apart, to be holy, and now they're starting to adapt. They're starting to take on sins. They're starting to take on the debaucherous activities of the Babylonians. Babylon was completely pagan, right? Meaning they were completely against and outside of God, right? They were not set apart in a good way. They were set apart in the bad way. They were living for themselves. Even the growing changes in the Israelites' hearts, as they started to remove themselves from the culture that God has set them apart with, there were some people that knew that their first love was the Lord, and they knew that the culture around them was not honoring to God. These people stood apart. Why? Because they didn't look like, they didn't walk like, and they didn't smell like the rest of the world. They didn't want to walk with the crowd. They wanted to march to the beat of a different drummer. How many of you remember Pastor Mark's sermon earlier, and he said, play louder, right? These Jews were playing louder. They knew that they didn't want to be a part, that the culture wasn't honoring to God. It wasn't like they were holding a massive, neon hotel, motel sign pointing at themselves, drawing attention. Here's the thing. I want you to take this note. They stood out because they stood apart. Let me repeat that. They stood out because they stood apart. How is the king? We just acknowledge that Nebuchadnezzar is a very proud, mighty king. So how is a king who has a pride issue, going to react to people trying to stand apart, trying not to adapt to his rule, trying not to submit? How do you think he's going to respond? Well, let's find out. I'll be picking up in Daniel 3, so I'm going to invite you to turn there now if you haven't already. Nebuchadnezzar is enjoying the benefits of his recent his conquest. He's at the center of attention. He's saying, look at me. He's the reason for much of Babylon's success. He's a strong leader. It sounds like out there, if he has an inflated ego, it's probably because he does, right? We're going to read as follows. So we're going to pick up in verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. All right, so let's stop right there. Does that answer your question if Nebuchadnezzar has a pride issue? Here he's building this massive golden statue of himself to be worshipped, right? Some of you might be wondering, well, what's a cubit? A cubit's approximately 18 inches. So that would make the statue 90 feet tall by 9 feet wide, made out of solid gold, right? This guy's got some major pride issues, right? This massive statue made out of solid gold, and Nebuchadnezzar decides that he's going to have this massive ribbon cutting ceremony. Remember when you dedicate a building, you cut the ribbon, and you have this big ceremony? So Nebuchadnezzar decides that he's going to do something similar to celebrate this big golden statue that he has. So let's continue, following in verse 1 again, in the midsection of the verse. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon, so it was that way they could see it. It was out in the open. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather. Now I'm going to be repeating this a lot, but I'm just going to say the leaders. We good with that? Because I'm going to be repeating this over and over again. I'll repeat it the first time. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So the leaders. Then the satraps, the leaders, and all the officials of the province gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, verse 4, and the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound," I'm going to be repeating this a lot again, so I'll just say musical instruments. When you hear the sound of the musical instruments, of every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the burning, fiery furnace. Now, let's pause right there. Nebuchadnezzar is having this massive celebration for this gold statue. He invites all the people of a position of power from his lands to attend a ceremony. Now, some of you older folks, maybe some of you know this guy, but how many of you remember President Teddy Roosevelt? Yeah. So Teddy Roosevelt was the president during the first decade of the 1900s. Now, I know you might not remember him personally, except Jimmy Overstreet somewhere out there. Just kidding, Jimmy. But some of you might have read about him in a history book or whatnot. This guy was a tough leader. He was the leader of the Rough Riders, this brigade of cavalry troops that fought in South America and a bunch of different places, Central America. He was tough. In fact, he was shot while exiting his vehicle, going to a speech, shot right in the chest. You know what he did? He plugged it with his finger and got up there and gave an 80-minute speech while he was shot in the chest. He's a tough guy. I just read about that the other day. You know what he did? His toughness transitioned into his American policy, right? He had his campaign slogan, speak softly and carry a big stick, right? Don't, obviously have the strength to back it up, but, you want to tread lightly. And that was kind of America at the time. It was weak internally. It was still young. It was growing. It was maturing. But he didn't want the rest of the world to see that. He didn't want the rest of the world to take advantage. So what he did was he had these big naval tours. He would have all these battleships lined up, and he would go into every port around the world of major countries. What he would say to them is, on these parades, he wouldn't throw out candy, but he would say, look at our guns. Don't mess with us. We're not a people that you want to mess with. All right? So he's saying, hey, we're strong. He's carrying that big stick. All right, Nebuchadnezzar is doing something similar here with this big golden statue. He's saying, I'm speaking loudly, and I'm carrying a big stick. You don't want to mess with me. That's why he's bringing all those governors and all those leaders, is he's saying, I'm not a person you want to cross. This is me, and you worship me. So let's continue on further. So picking up in the chapters here. Therefore, at a certain time, the Chaldeans, right? So who are the Chaldeans? So the Chaldeans were a group of people that were very vile and nasty, all right? They were in the Mesopotamian region. They were Babylonians. So these Chaldeans, these strong men, were against the Jews, and we're going to find that out. So the Chaldeans came forward, and they maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the musical instruments, and every kind of music, shall bow down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the burning fiery furnace. Thank you. Sorry, I'm choking up here. Get a little dry sometimes. So they shall be cast into the burning fiery furnace. But let's go back. Let's revisit some passages. So therefore, as soon as, once the musical instruments have heard, so now the Chaldeans are responding, well, there's some dissenters in the ranks. So therefore, as soon as the peoples heard the sound of the musical instruments, they were worshiping. They were bowing down to different idols, right? They submitted to King Nebuchadnezzar, but there were some that didn't submit, right? And that kind of relates to us because, we might not be bowing down to a golden statue, but, we bow down to idols all the time, right? We might worship, Pastor Mark preached about this a little bit later in the past, but they preached about they worshiped all different idols, whether it's, if it's drunkenness, whether it's the debaucherous activities at the time, they worshipped, these false idols in Babylon. We don't really know why some of the Babylonians kneeled. Maybe because, they were afraid, right? Because if they're going to be cast and thrown into the burning fiery furnace, they're going to say, well, let's conform. Let's play this game. I don't want to get thrown into any fire today. I'm just going to submit, right? Maybe it's fear. Or maybe the people enjoyed what they were doing. They were worshiping wine. They're worshiping the lifestyle, debauchery, military success. So maybe they bowed down because they believed that Nebuchadnezzar was a pretty awesome guy. He was doing, he was leading them into a golden, year. He was leading them into this golden age where they're feeling pretty comfortable, right? Maybe they were bowing, because they idolized their leader. They saw him as this big, strong, mighty man. So they're like, you know what? This Nebuchadnezzar guy isn't that bad. Maybe I'll worship my political leader because he's doing a good job at what he's doing, right? So whatever their reasons were for bowing down, whether it was fear, desire, idolizing, they bow down to the statue. All right, let me ask you, what's one of the 10 commandments? The first one, I am the Lord. You shall not have no other gods before me. Israel had an extremely poor track record of keeping this. If you look back in the past in the Old Testament, they were, Moses, remember Moses back in the past? Some of you that were in Sunday school, Moses delivered the Hebrew people out from Egypt, right? God used Moses to deliver his people, and the first thing that the people did was they worshipped golden images in the wilderness. You might be thinking, well, how ungrateful. He just delivered a people from slavery, God, but now we're going to go turn and worship something else. We're going to say, you know what, Lord, you don't satisfy my needs. They started worshiping other things. So, again, going back, Pastor Mark talked about this in the past. We might not bow down to this big statue, but we might be worshiping money, might be worshiping power, success, addictions, alcohol, drugs, inappropriate relationships, whatever the case may be. Maybe you're like Nebuchadnezzar himself, all proud and mighty, worshiping himself. You might not be kneeling down to that 90-foot statue, right? But we do it all the time. Maybe your idol looks like this. Psst, psst, psst. Hey, Mary, did you hear what Barbara over there did the other day? Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's I really shouldn't do X. I really shouldn't do this thing. But you know what? I'll give it up next week. Or maybe I'll give it up next month. Right? Then it just continues to go and go. It doesn't just stop next week. It doesn't just stop the next month. It just continues to go and go. Whatever that idol might be, right? And I say this to you because, I bowed at the altar of the world 9 times for every 10th I stood up for Christ. As Pastor always says, there's one finger pointing you, 3 fingers pointing back at me. I join you in this because I've screwed up myself, and we all have, right? We need to take a serious examination of ourselves and figure out what statue, what idol are we bowing at today? The world wants you to look like the world, wants you to act like the world, and wants you to smell like the world. Let me just tell you something today. Living like the world leads to death, right? Do not do it. We flee from it. And you might be out there wondering, well, how do we stand up when it seems like everything's stacked against us? This world's bearing down, people are dying, sin's transpiring around us. So where is the hope, you might ask? Let's continue in Daniel 3, verse 8, and let's find out. So we just talked about this, the Chaldeans, right? The Chaldeans were these people that were vile and nasty, right? And they go to King Nebuchadnezzar. So let's read in verse 9. They declare to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the musical instruments and every kind of music shall bow down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship this should be thrown into the burning fiery furnace. There are some certain Jews whom you have appointed over leadership of the provinces of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." All right, so let's discuss this right here. We have this group of men known as the Chaldeans, and I just mentioned them. They're vile, they're nasty, right? They're gossipers, they're slanderers, right? They're actual Babylonians. What do they do when they first enter King Nebuchadnezzar's court? They say, "O king, live forever," right? They're paying superficial homage, which is a nice way of saying they're sucking up to Nebuchadnezzar, right? They really are. They're paying this superficial homage or sucking up, and they accuse these 3 Jews, right, of not upholding Nebuchadnezzar's decree. And these are the central characters of today's lesson, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Every biblical scholar will note that the Chaldeans were jealous. They were some nasty, vile people. They saw these Jews in power, and they're like, you know what? What are these foreigners doing leading our land? We want that power for ourselves. We're gonna strike them down. That might be their golden statue, right? That might be the thing that they're bowing down is knocking out the leadership, taking them out, right? Because they wanted that power for themselves. They see these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, defying power. And these Chaldeans are like lions on the prowl, looking for who they can devour, right? They want to strike. They want to, harm these people. So we just acknowledge that King Nebuchadnezzar has some serious, serious pride issues. So how do you think he's going to respond to this when these Chaldeans are like, "Hey, those Jews over there, they're not listening to you. They're like putting their noses up to you." Saying, they're literally, defying everything that you called them to be, right? So let's find out how Nebuchadnezzar responds to these Chaldeans and their charge against the Jews. So picking up in verse 13, "Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, 'Is it true, O king, Shadrach, Meshach, is it true O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up. Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the musical instruments and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have set up and made well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. So let's pause right there. Sorry, I just need a moment to. Nebuchadnezzar is repeating to these Jewish men that they hadn't heard it the first time, right? Surely no one would ever knowingly defy the great King Nebuchadnezzar. So he's kind of repeating it to them like they didn't hear it. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, because maybe in their thick heads it didn't register, right? Also, let's remind them of the penalty of defying the great King Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar decides that he's going to remind these Jews of the cost of what they're doing, right? They're standing up, they're standing firm. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, this is picking up in verse 16, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So how do these Jews respond, right? They respond by saying, we'd rather die. What faith, right? They're saying, we know the consequences of refusing, but we're not willing to relent. We're not willing to give in. These Jews, they're not backing off. They're not retreating under the pressure. They're standing firm in the faith. They acknowledge that they either would stand with God rather than submit, right? They rather die than worship this golden image. Why? Because they understand that the Lord is their God above everything. They remain faithful. If they remain true, right? They remain faithful. The Lord may rescue them. He may not, right? Either way, it's a win-win. Why? Because if they die, they get to go home to the Lord and be with him in heaven. If they stand firm in the faith and the Lord rescues them, they're still not submitting. They're still not worshiping. So it's a win-win for them. They fear the Lord than they do this powerful man, this King Nebuchadnezzar. And this country may, not have our lives placed on the line, but we might start, feeling the pressure of anti-Christian sentiments and lifestyles that bear down on us, right? People may ask us to be silent about Jesus. Nothing new under the sun, right? In fact, I was at a restaurant one time, and I was praying, and I was talking to a brother in Christ about the Christian faith, and we were approached by a woman, that said, hey, this public place is not a proper place to be talking about faith or Christianity or anything like that. We're not being loud or rude, but this lady felt the need, to kind of enforce her anti-Christian sentiments on us. Right? This isn't new, right? Because the Sanhedrin Council did the very same thing to the apostles. There's like, no, apostles, you can't preach in Jesus anymore. You can't talk about him. We just crucified him, and you're not allowed to share your faith anymore. If you do, we're going to beat you. We're going to throw you in prison. What did the Jews do? The apostles, what did the apostles do? They said, we're going to go and we're going to pray for boldness. And they went out and they prayed for boldness, and they did not relent, regardless of that pressure that was put on them, right? They'd rather die, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, than withhold the truth from people. So let's pick up in verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it usually was heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men, so strong guys of his army, to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their garments. They were thrown into the burning fiery furnace because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated. The flame of the fire killed those men who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. let's breathe. In the furnace, if this furnace is any indication of Nebuchadnezzar and his rage and his strength, the furnace was heated 7 times hotter than it usually was. He wanted to ensure that these Jews that were defying him were perished and killed and murdered and burned. He wanted them turned into a pile of ashes as soon as possible, right? Typical executions involve some public spectacle, right? That involved embarrassment, humiliation. The people being executed were usually stripped naked. They were led through the public square of the town, right? There's a public announcement of the crimes that this person committed. Following that announcement, the person would be publicly executed, right? It was out there in front of people. Why? Because they didn't want that person committing the same sin or crime that the accused was doing, right? It was to embarrass them, but it was also to set an example. We don't want you doing this, right? So from the text, it makes note that the men were thrown in with their clothes on, right? Their tunics, their hats, and whatnot. That's an indication of how angry Nebuchadnezzar is, because he's so angry he wanted them dead now. There's no time for a public spectacle. As soon as possible, these men need to be murdered, right? They need to be thrown into that fire. They need to be made an example of. We don't have a time for this public spectacle. So that's how angry he is. So what does Nebuchadnezzar do? Well, he watches from a distance. He runs to the furnace to see if the 3 men are dead, see if he accomplished killing these men. Picking up in verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, he's looking in the furnace, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? His leaders, the counselors around him, they respond. They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said to them, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like the Son of God's." You might be out there like Nebuchadnezzar today, and you might be wondering, well, who is that 4th man, right? Wasn't there 3 men thrown into the fire? This is impossible because, as we read earlier, the guards were killed, the big guys, right? They threw them into the fire, and they were just killed from the heat. It was that hot, right? Nebuchadnezzar must be thinking, well, what's going on here? There's something different about this 4th figure, something supernatural. The best his pagan mind could wrap his head around is that the 4th man in the furnace appeared to be like the Son of God's. However altered their thinking might be, they're right in the fact that it was the Son, not of God's, but of the one true God, the image of the invisible God, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the King of kings. Yes, friends, it was Christ there in the midst of his furnace with his people. We refer to this as a Christophany, which is a term that refers to the physical manifestation of Christ. And he shielded his people that not one fiery flame singed their hair, right? And Christ does that for us because, as we're sinners, it's demanded that God's wrath fall upon us, but Christ drank the cup that was rightfully ours. That not one drop of God's wrath spilled out and hit us, right? That's our mighty man. That's Christ. That's whom we worship today. That is God himself. Let's pick up in verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fire furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the leaders and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of the fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make this decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses be laid in ruin, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Let's pause right there. So what happened in this moment? This mighty pagan king Nebuchadnezzar, right? This strong man, this mighty man, this man filled with pride. He is God to his people, right? Building this golden statue, Nebuchadnezzar himself found out who God is. He had an encounter with the one, I am, Yahweh, right? Elohim, all the names for God. He encountered the God that we worship. In that very moment, everything that Nebuchadnezzar thought to be true came crashing down. So he came to that realization, and he was overwhelmed with this revelation of truth that Nebuchadnezzar had nowhere to go but his knees in worship. He had seen real faith tested in fire through these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he knew it was real. So where do we go from here? How can we now apply this to our Christian life, right? We talked about how we might not worship this golden 90-foot statue, but we might worship other things in our life, right? We might be bowing down to gossip. We might be bowing down to slander and all those different things. We might be worshiping our addictions, right? So where do we go? How many of you out there have heard this familiar song? It's one of my favorites. I've decided to follow Jesus. So by show of hands, Bill, yeah, a few people. So the song's lyrics were initially penned by a man named Thaxton, who lived in the Assad tribal regions of India. He was overwhelmed with who God is, right, because he was a pagan before this, overwhelmed like Nebuchadnezzar. During his conversion, Thaxton penned the words to the song that we love and cherish today. His family was converted to Christianity, and they began to worship the Lord as a family. The village chief and the elders and the villagers that were around there, they were displeased that Thaxton and his family converted and started worshiping the Most High God. In a public spectacle and charade, the family was brought out in front of the village, right? The village chief gave a decree: you will recant your faith, or you will surely die. Similar to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Thaxton was faced with a critical decision. He began to sing the lines to the song he had written during his conversion, I've decided to follow Jesus. Song reads as follows: I've decided to follow Jesus, no turning back, no turning back. I've decided to follow Jesus, no turning back, no turning back. Villagers so fit with rage that they wouldn't submit, they wouldn't relent, they murdered his children. Thaxton, overwhelmed with grief, all he could do was just continue to sing this song. Though none go with me, still I will follow. Though none go with me, still I will follow. No turning back, no turning back. With that, they tragically ended the life of Thaxton's wife. Thaxton was now left with his own life in his hands. Would he relent, or would he continue to worship Jesus? Regardless of the cost, regardless of what's happening, would he continue to worship in the midst of his fiery furnace? Thaxton continues to sing out loud, the cross before me, the world behind me. The cross before me, the world behind me, no turning back, no turning back. This line has so much power. Why? Because Thaxton wasn't just merely leaving the world behind and running to the foot of the cross like we all do during our conversion. This exact same line has so much power because Thaxton is marching to his own execution, knowing that today he would be with the Lord in paradise. So the story doesn't just end there, right? They tragically end this family who is worshiping the Lord. Thaxton was murdered. His family was murdered. They were with the Lord in paradise. They had to make a stand for their faith. It doesn't just end there. Much like Nebuchadnezzar, overwhelmed with seeing who God is, real faith tested through the furnace, this village chief was so moved by this display of faith that they repented, they turned from their sin, and they began worshiping Jesus as a village. And it didn't just stop there. It began to spread to other villages and other villages. Why? Because they all saw this real faith tested in the furnace today. So similar to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this family, Thaxton's family, took this stand for the faith. Now as Micah comes up and he's going to continue playing I've Decided to Follow Jesus, we're going to have a time to reflect on our own lives, right? Because maybe out there today, you're bowing at your own statue, whatever that may be, whether it's alcohol, whether it's addiction, whether it's problems, whatever it may be. We all have bowed down at golden statues. We all have worshipped at the altar of the world. Maybe you're out there and you're struggling today, and we want you to invite you to come up here so that we can pray for you. And we want to help you find that lasting peace that's found in Jesus Christ. We want to help you find liberation from whatever sin you're dealing with. Or maybe you're out there like Nebuchadnezzar, this village chief, and today you found out who God is, right? You've seen him in this message, and you want to start following him. You don't want to bow down at that statue anymore. You want to start pursuing and following after him. So we're going to invite you to come up as well. Or maybe you're sitting out there and say, you know what, I want to get baptized, or I want to become a member of this church. We're going to invite you to come up as well. I'm going to ask Pastor to come up as well as another recipient. But we just want to invite you guys to come up now. And maybe it's not so much what you did do, but what you didn't do, right? Maybe you're not sharing your faith as much as you should. Or maybe you're just struggling with not being bold and not sharing your faith. Again, we're going to invite you to come up as well. And after we're concluding with this, I'm going to pray on everyone here, and we're going to sing, I Decided to Follow Jesus, as an affirmation of what we discussed today. And we're going to continue to worship Jesus in the midst of our fiery furnaces. So please come.